And now it's time for Mob Talk Radio with your host, Jeff Canarsie.
And welcome to Mob Talk Radio. I am your host, Jeff Canarsie. This is our second show for the week. We are going to cover Carmine Galante, and I'm going to answer a lot of questions as much as I can today, and then we'll be back following next Saturday. You can reach us at Twitter at RealMobTalk7. Check us out on Facebook at Mob Talk Radio. Send questions, threats, complaints, the usual, that direction. The GOTTI movie is out in full swing. Lots of different narratives going on about that. I have not personally seen a single review from someone who actually went and saw the film who didn't like it. That's not me being biased. I'm just being honest. I really haven't. The other thing I wanted to mention really quick about that is that there seems to be this emphasis to for people to go to Rotten Tomatoes, which is a junk site to begin with. But what people don't realize is that a site like that publishes 17 reviews from well-known critics. What they don't include in that is the people who actually went and saw the fucking movie, because when you go to the audience comments, there's tons of them, and when you read them, they're all good. But nobody's mentioning that. There's a lot of critics that are putting out a lot of false information, a lot of narratives that aren't true. I'm not a conspiracy theorist by any stretch of the imagination here, but obviously people are out to sink the film. And I think it's bullshit because it's a good film. I enjoyed it. The other thing, too, is that I left 2 reviews on Rotten Tomatoes, and they were both removed. Didn't swear, didn't curse, didn't do nothing. I just reviewed the film like I always do and like I did the other night after I saw the film, and they took it down. So obviously there's some sort of, I don't know if it's pro-government people are coming out and I don't know. It's just a little weird to me. The other thing, too, that I wanted to say, this film is not glorifying anything. Anybody that says that this film is glorifying murder, mayhem, and etc. obviously didn't see the fucking film. My job is not to stick up for the film or to stick up for anybody else. I'm just telling you from my perspective. I think it's bullshit. I think John Travolta said it best when he was interviewed, and I forget which channel he was on. How do people think this is glorified? The man spent the rest of his life in prison. The man died of cancer. He died alone for the most part. Peter was there, but for the most part, he wasn't surrounded by his family. So I don't understand where the glorification comes in. If people are going to say that, then they should have gone after every single mob film like that, and they didn't. They don't go near Scorsese with that. So it goes to show that there is a narrative. And I want to bring up one thing, and this should prove my point. When the film debuted in Cannes, in France, there were reports out that reporters saw it. I know for a fact that that's not true. Not a single reporter saw it. Reporters, from my understanding, nobody was there to be able to critique the film. For whatever that reason, that's fine. But one of the interesting things that came out the next day was really, really caught my attention. And I don't care if they didn't like the film. That's not what my issue is. But somebody there who wrote a write-up which started this said that John Gotti Jr., who was a murderer, had no business being there. And when Cannes starts letting in, people of nefarious backgrounds, that's wrong and it should have never happened. First of all, none of that's true, all right, about John Gotti Jr. And then the second thing on top of that is all sorts of people go to France. All sorts of people go to this film shit. Harvey Weinstein, you don't seeing them say shit about that, or any of these actors that have been in trouble for other shit. They don't say nothing about that. So I think if you're going to accuse one and try to chastise one, then they all should be up and down the line fucking held responsible. I think that when you start an article reviewing a film and you start with John Gotti this, John Gotti Jr. that, John Gotti Jr. that, John Gotti Jr. that, then you're already flawed. The article's flawed because you obviously have a personal issue with John Gotti Jr. who you probably never fucking met in your life. So the reality is that it's a good film, but it seems like there's backlash, but the backlash is coming from people who haven't even seen the film. So all that being said, I don't want to get into anything else about it. Just go see the film. It's a great film. You'll enjoy it. And that's all I want to say about that. Oh, and here's the other thing. Here's what outlets aren't mentioning. It's selling out in a lot of fucking places. So it's not like they're just not reporting this. And I don't get it. And the other thing, too, is when you open up in 500 theaters, in comparison to most of these other films are opening up to 3,000, 5,000 theaters, what do you expect? 500 theaters is really nothing. But when I sat down and I did the math versus what the box office said that they made, and did the math on what they would have opened up to in 1,000 or 2,000 theaters, they'd have made $3-point-something million the first opening night. So the idea that this is somehow a failure on any kind of financial realm is bullshit. The film was $10 million to make. They're going to make that back plus some. So I don't really understand where this narrative is coming from. And all that being said, and I also think Hollywood doesn't like independent films. I think Hollywood has always been against smaller independent films. And so it is what it is, but that's where I stand as far as that goes. Now, the first bit of news I want to talk about is Frank Salemme, and why I'm bringing him up. I have avoided this story for a long time. Obviously, if you don't know who he was a former boss who entered WITSEC, became a rat, etc., etc. He is on trial for the murder of a nightclub owner named Stephen DeSaro, and this murder took place in 1993. Salemme has a co-defendant named Paul Wiedek, and they're basically accused of killing him to prevent him from cooperating with the police who were investigating Salemme at the time. DeSaro's body wasn't found until March 2016 after an informant told the police where the body was. The body was then found behind an old mill in Providence, Rhode Island. Salemme currently is 84. He denies all the charges. Closing arguments are to begin Monday in Boston. Like I said, Salemme was the boss from the early 90s till about 99. He enters WITSEC. Stephen Flemmi, another fucking rat, is testifying against Salemme. And this is what's so ludicrous about this. And this is why I haven't covered it. First of all, if this does not show you corruption from the FBI's perspective, it's bad enough John Connolly was a fucking disgrace. Lynn Del Vecchio is a fucking disgrace from the FBI. This is what they do. Salemme kills somebody, and he does not tell the FBI he does that. When you go in and you sit down, you are supposed to tell them A through Z. You don't cover up anything. You don't deny anything. You admit to everything, and you get a pass because you're ratting out everybody else. So Salemme doesn't bring this up, doesn't tell the FBI, apparently, which we can argue that either way. And now all of a sudden he's facing murder charges even after he's in WITSEC. Do me a favor. Go to YouTube, type in WITSEC Mafia, look at John Gotti Jr.'s next project, his next book. This is what WITSEC Mafia is all about. These people go into WITSEC and they lie. They tailor their fucking testimony in court. They tailor all the information that the FBI wants them to fucking tailor to get this guy arrested and that guy arrested. Then they go out and they start committing crimes again. Now, this situation's a little different in the respect of, and I'm going to compare it to Sammy to fucking prick Gravano. Gravano wasn't honest about everything he did. Because there was, when you go back in time, you look at Sammy Gravano, and Gaspipe Casso starts opening his mouth about Sammy selling drugs and doing this and doing that. The FBI got freaked out because they knew Gravano was full of shit. They wanted a certain narrative out of Gravano. And so what they did was they took Casso's fucking agreement and they tore it up because he was making the FBI look bad and he was making Sammy Gravano look exactly how he is, a shriveled up old prune rat motherfucker. That's the fucking truth. And we have seen this for fucking decades with the FBI and fucking informants. This isn't just isolated. This isn't one or two events. This is multiple events. And so once again, moving right along, Obviously, Sammy Gravano doesn't tell the complete truth. He gets a good deal, gets forgiven for 19 murders, and nobody mentions that he killed a fucking kid. You know, Alan Kaiser, nobody brings that shit up. Karen Gravano doesn't bring that shit up. None of them do. But he gets out, what's he do? He starts selling drugs with kids. Come on. You know, gets 20-year bit, gets out, then he wants to open his fucking mouth again like he's somebody. The point is that this is just another glowing fucking example of rats that lie. Salemme's a rat. He lied. And here's the proof. He's saying that, I didn't do this, but yet whoever the tipster is, and Flemmi's testifying a rat versus rat, it's like Ganji and Alite all over again. But that's the point. This proves that rats lie. They don't tell the truth. This is what I've been saying. This is what John Gotti Jr. is saying. A lot of people keep saying that John Gotti Jr. now wants to be a crime fighter. That's the wrong moniker for this. That's the wrong moniker for this. He's not being a crime fighter. He's exposing something that's been going on forever. What, 5 trials, 4 years? What the fuck is this guy supposed to think? Every fucking rat comes out of the woodwork. They testify their fucking... Look at J.R. Rubio from the Joey Merlino case. Same kind of deal. Lie, 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 lie. And most of the time, unfortunately, it works. But in the case of Rubio, it didn't. And other people, it didn't. But this is once more a glowing fucking example that there needs to be reformation on the way that witnesses are handled by the FBI. They should no longer get sweet deals. They should just rip that right off the table and say, you know what? Did you commit murder? Yes. You're going to do a minimum of 21 years. Not 2, not 4, 20 years. You are going to do 20 years. And that's the thing. Just based on what happened to Alan Kaiser with Sammy Gravano, he should have never gotten out of fucking prison to begin with. They should have left him in that fuckhole wherever the hell he was and let him wither away to like the fucking prune he is. And that's my point. How do you forgive murder? You can't. You know, and I get it. There's this whole fucking argument of, well, you know, it's the mob. That's what they do. Sure, I can understand that on a certain level. But at some fucking point, we have to hold the FBI accountable. We have to hold the handlers accountable. It's ridiculous. So for people that are going out and saying, John Gotti Jr. wants to be a crime solver, that's not the case. He's merely pointing out a glowing, obvious fact. That's his narrative. That's his book. That's what he's got going on. And that's a good project, believe it or not. I fully support that project. I think it's time that we change the narrative. I once heard when I was a kid, you used to play cops and robbers. Some of your friends want to be cops. Some of your friends want to be robbers. And the whole idea is robbers do what they do, right? Cops do what they do. So what it should be is, all right, you know who I am. I know who you are. Prove what I do. That's the way it should be. But instead, they bring in everybody and their mother. Half these people don't even know other people. But if you tailor your testimony enough, if you practice lying enough, this is exactly what happens. And I am by in no means defending anybody that's ever been arrested for atrocious shit. I'm just saying, but when you're walking in to defend yourself and it's stacked against you because of people telling on other people and they get their heinous crimes forgiven, that's ridiculous. We live in a society where it's become, well, if you tell on somebody, doesn't matter what you do. Doesn't matter what you do. And that's just a sad reality of life. But in the case of Salemme, once again, this is just a rat ratting on a rat. I could give a fuck less if they find him guilty or not. The guy's a piece of shit. But it just goes to show that, Salemme, when he did his debriefings with his 302s, he wasn't honest about that murder. So once again, the question we have to ask is, why? Why is it that the FBI buys everything that they fucking say? And sure, any big company you have, any big agency you have, you're going to have fuck-ups, you're going to have mistakes. But this has been repeated for 30 fucking years. There doesn't seem to be an oversight. There wasn't any oversight with John Connolly. There wasn't any oversight with Lynn Del Vecchio, who should have been fucking locked up for murder. Same thing as John Connolly. And that's my whole point. So all that being said, we're going to cut to a break. When we come back, we're going to get to your questions, and then we're going to get on to Carmine Galante. Stay tuned, Mob Talk Radio. In my travels, I'm always looking for a clothing brand that I feel like represents me. Anybody can go to a store and buy a t-shirt with a gimmick, but if you believe in 3 core values like I do, loyalty, honor, and respect, then look no further than Omerta brand clothing. You can catch them at omertamia.com, OMERTAMIA.com, with locations in Europe, California, Boston, Brooklyn, Florida, Pennsylvania, and Washington. They have a great clothing line with hats, shirts, sweatshirts, keychains, anything you might need, stickers. You want the rats to stop snitching? Go right out and get yourself a sticker. But if you want to live your life by the gentleman's code, look no further than Omerta brand clothing. I've said it before on my show. Anywhere I go, I like to have a favorite restaurant to go and eat and just kind of be myself. And one of the best restaurants that I have been to probably ever at this point is Kitchen Consigliere, run by Angelo Lutz in Collingswood, New Jersey. If you're coming out of New York and heading to Philly, stop in and see Angelo at 700 Haddon Avenue, Collingswood, New Jersey. Make sure you call and make a reservation if you're going to go. 856-854-2156. Remember, every Sunday is Sangria Sunday. Just the ambiance, the decor, the food, the staff is friendly and courteous and go out of their way to make your dining experience absolutely perfect. I would never ever stray you. I would never ever send you to the wrong place. Believe me, you can follow Kitchen Consigliere at KitCon Cafe on Twitter. And please, if you're heading through out of Philly, if you're heading towards Philly, stop in and see Angelo at Kitchen Consigliere. And welcome back to Mob Talk Radio. I am going to answer a few of your questions, and then we're going to get to Carmine Galante. Okay, question number 1. Albert Gallo, what became after him after Joey got killed? It appears he's still alive today. Did he stay in the mob, or did he go straight? From what I understand, he transferred to the Genovese crime family, and at one point allegedly was an acting capo at a crime family, I believe. From what somebody told me, he's pretty much retired at this point, but he didn't really go straight. He just went into the Genovese crime family. Okay. Is there activity in Florida, Miami, Tampa area, and etc.? Yeah, there is. Florida has always been considered an open territory. The Traficantes really ran Florida for a long time with an open fist. But that criminal organization is not defunct, but it might as well be at this point. It's a lot different down there. Every mob family has connections down there, but probably the biggest family being representative down in Florida, other than the cartels, would be the Gambino crime family. Okay, was Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky addicted to heroin? That's the first I've ever heard of that. I don't believe that to be the case. I don't think either one of them, really on any level, could have been involved in organized crime if they were on drugs like that. Was Carlo Gambino a hitman before being a godfather? Absolutely. Carlo Gambino, obviously, who was born in Italy, was doing mob hits for crime bosses at a very young age in his teenage years, and ultimately he ends up getting made at 19 years old before coming over to this country. But if you're asking me how many people, I don't know, but I know that history always looks back and makes the claim that he did. Can I prove it? No. Okay, next question. Tell people how powerful Russell Buffalino was. If you want to go to YouTube and type in Mob Talk Radio Russell Buffalino, I did a huge show on him. Russell Buffalino was really a powerful guy. In comparison to like a Frank Costello, he had a lot of political power. Russell Buffalino was involved in a lot of history's biggest things. Obviously, we're going to see that with The Irishman coming out starring Robert De Niro and Al Pacino. It's going to be an absolutely fantastic film, and I think that you're going to learn a lot more about Buffalino. They didn't call him the Silent Don or the Quiet Don for no reason. At one point, he was even running the Genovese crime family while he was running his own. But what made him different than everybody else was that not only was he just respected, but he had a commission seat as well. But what made him different was he took legitimate enterprises and made them successful. He was really the first mob guy. Mob guys would take their money and try to wash it through laundromats or flower shops or bowling alleys or whatever, or restaurants. Buffalino dumped his money into coal and into steel companies, and a lot of people in those days didn't think like that. And whether or not, I don't think it was to legitimize himself, but he knew that he had to put money somewhere where he could turn a profit, and that's what made him strong. He just made good decisions in general. like I said, he was a part of some of history's biggest things, and that's what makes him very powerful. He also controlled a lot of unions. He controlled the Godfather film. A lot of people like to say that Joe Colombo controlled that, but it wasn't him. It was Russell Bufalino who told Mario Puzo, who told Coppola what was going to go into that film and what wasn't going to go into that film. Bufalino had that kind of power, and that's something that you don't hear about very often. Now, if you go back to The Godfather 1, when Marlon Brando, Don Corleone, sends Tom Hagen, who was played by, Robert Duvall, when he goes out to see the guy that was Lutz, who was running the fucking movie pictures and all of that, and he goes out to try to bargain with him. That was like Bufalino. Bufalino had that kind of power, but a lot isn't known because he was able to just kind of keep himself off the radar. All right, how far do mob crimes go? ID theft, stock fraud. Listen, with anything else in life, things change with technology, things change with surveillance techniques. The mob has long been involved in pretty much everything that you possibly can think of. They're involved in a lot of stock fraud now, and other things of that nature. I remember when calling cards came out, that was a big thing that they were doing. Cell phone stuff they're doing. Listen, if there is a way that the mob can infiltrate something and make money, that's exactly what they're going to do. That's what they've always done. So the changing times with everything else, they're just going to move ahead. ID theft, it would surprise me if they were doing that. That really honestly sounds something more like what the Russians would be into. That seems to be the Russian niche, at least in Brooklyn, and from my experience, has been medical fraud. That's their fucking bread and butter. And so the Italians are a little different in that sense. I mean, I think if they could do it, they probably would. They have done it before, but not on the scale that the Russians are actually doing it as we speak. But yeah, ID theft, stock fraud, absolutely. I think if you can get your hands in it somewhere and make some money, that's exactly what you're going to do. All right. Who was a bigger earner, Gaspipe Casso or Jimmy Burke? Well, we're talking about two different time periods here now. Jimmy Burke, 50s, 60s, 70s, cut off a little bit past 70s for Jimmy Burke's heyday. Gaspipe Casso, 80s, totally different, similar guys, both animals, both capable of earning a fuckload of money. But I think ultimately Casso probably was a bigger earner in the sense of he had his hands in the garment district and had some hands in things that Jimmy Burke really couldn't get his hands on. Jimmy Burke wasn't going to touch the garment district. There was no way anybody would ever let him go near that. The fact that Jimmy Burke was able to work with the Gambinos and other crime family, the Gambinos and the Lucchese's, by getting into Idlewild Airport, JFK, that was a huge thing. But Gaspipe Casso is a little different in the sense of he was able to infiltrate unions, garbage hauling. He was able to extort them. He was able to move into the garment district, and that is big. That's a bigger scale. Jimmy Burke may have had one or two like Lufthansa's going on and armored car hijackings and all of this kind of stuff. But I think that's a one-time hit. You go out, you hit it, you make a couple $100,000, and you're done. Whereas Gaspipe could sit on 15 different projects at once and continue the inflow of money. It just never ended. But ultimately, Casso turned out to be a fucking rat, scumbag piece of shit. And Jimmy Burke didn't. He took it on the chin, went to prison, and died like a fucking man. And so I think legitimately, at the end of the day, Casso probably made more money. But I think, who's the bigger gangster was Jimmy Burke. They're both psychopaths. They both killed people. But I think Jimmy Burke was straight up gangster, whereas Casso just more psychopath, in my opinion. All right. Would you consider Della Croce to be the most powerful underboss ever? How much influence do you think he had with Carlo Gambino and Paul Castellano? I think that Carlo Gambino was the biggest underboss ever in the mafia, and I say that because he worked under Albert Anastasia for a long time, until Carlo saw his way to clip Anastasia and get rid of him and then take over as boss. However, Della Croce was a straight fucking gangster. Della Croce loved Anastasia, and when Gambino did what he did, it didn't sit well with Della Croce, but he let it go because he believed in a philosophy of the boss is the boss is the boss. I've repeated that a million times, and I always will. Della Croce got in line, and he did what he was supposed to do. And a lot of guys don't have that capability. He held his tongue and just did what was best for business and what he did, which was best for the family. But I don't think he necessarily had a lot of influence on Paul Castellano. I think that Paul didn't trust him, and for good reason. with Carlo, he probably had a lot more levity. And I say that because Carlo probably realized that, look, this guy didn't have to sit well with this. He didn't have to accept it, and he did. So I'm going to make him the underboss, and that's just the way it's going to be. But I also think that, in terms of when Carlo died, he made Paul boss because he wanted to keep the family together, the bloodline of the Cosa Nostra. He wanted the crime family to be the bloodline. That's why Della Croce was not given leadership of the family. But I think that ultimately, at the end of the day, Della Croce probably had influence with Carlo. Carlo probably asked him, I would imagine, a lot of things. I'm sure he inputted his advice on a lot of things. But with Paul, I don't think he had much leeway. Paul was a different character altogether. Paul was a business guy, not a fucking gangster. And like I said, we could rehash the whole Gotti, Angelo Ruggiero drama again, but it's, I've said that a million times and I've spoken about that a million times. But at the end of the day, I think Della Croce really had at least some influence with Carlo, but I think that ended when Carlo died. Let's see. If John Gotti was successful in his bid to get Joey Massino his seat back on the commission, how would this have affected the Genovese crime family? Would they have been forced to forge an alliance with the Lucchese's to offset the Massino and Gotti power? Absolutely. Totally agree. First of all, you have to understand why the commission seat was taken away from the Bonanos to begin with. And that has to do with Joe Bonanno and the way he behaved, refusing to come in and speak to the commission after he wanted to order the death of Carlo Gambino and others, the rest of the commission. And Joe Magliocco actually went to the commission and said, look, this was his plan. This is what he wanted to do. And as a result, they threw him out of the mob and shelved him. But Bonanno refused to come in to speak to them. Instead, Bonanno took off and ran, faked a kidnapping, just tried to hide out from them, and just really went against everything that the mob was for in those days. Joe Bonanno, historically, in my opinion, was one of the worst Cosa Nostra bosses ever. I don't think he was that smart. I think he did a lot of damage to the mob in a lot of ways. But had Joey Massino gotten a seat on the commission, I think that puts, obviously, the Bonanos back in power. I think that with a relative partnership with the Gambinos, with Gotti being boss at that time, they would have been a powerhouse. And the Genoveses technically would have been, at that time, the second biggest mob family, the second most powerful mob family, but I think that automatically would have put the Bonanos back on the seat. It would have made them very powerful, and the Genoveses may not have had any other choice but to align themselves with the Lucchese's and probably the Colombos too, just to try to keep up a power base. Then again, also, the Bonanos didn't get a seat back. Joey Massino ends up becoming a rat, who did a ton of damage to the fucking Bonanos, did a ton of fucking damage to the Mafia in general too. So I guess we can kind of argue that, but because Massino becomes a rat, I don't even know. Maybe the question to ask is, if Massino gets that commission seat back, does he end up turning a rat? I guess we'll never know. But you know what? I'm going to tell you something. Once a rat, always a rat. Guys that end up testifying in court against other people and ratting people out, they always had the rat gene in them. They always had that gene inside of them. But it either has a tendency of showing itself or it doesn't. I will never know why Joey Massino did what he did. But you know what? For everything that Joey Massino at one point was a big, tough guy, a very knowledgeable, smart, crafty guy, but he turned out to be a piece of shit like the rest of them. Didn't want to do time, and that's sort of the way it went. All right. Here's a really good question. Why didn't John Gotti just bide his time with Paul Castellano? Couldn't have Gotti just not forced a hostile takeover after Paul went away? That's a really interesting question, and let me rephrase this. The person that's asking this question wants to know, couldn't have Gotti just sat back and waited? Instead of doing what he did, wait for Paul to go to prison, and just then do a hostile takeover? Well, the answer to that is no. We've been through this sort of narrative of what this is. And at the time, the problem is that Paul Castellano wanted to disassemble John Gotti's crew. That was bad news for John Gotti. He was going to lose whatever power he had. He was going to lose the people he trusted. That was Paul's sort of slap on the ass for the drug bullshit that Angelo Ruggiero got himself involved in. Obviously Paul Castellano wanted copies of the tapes of Angelo Ruggiero, which the whole ha-ha moment for all of this is Paul Castellano already had transcripts. He knew exactly what Angelo said. It was simply a test in the narrative of Gotti, and it was a test of Della Croce. He wanted to see if Gotti would kill Angelo, which Gotti wasn't about to. And he wanted to see if Della Croce would take his side or Gotti's side. And obviously Della Croce stalled and wasn't going to help Paul in any stretch of the imagination. And Gotti did what he had to do. I don't think this idea that it was fear because he was going to get killed, I don't buy that for a minute. I don't think John Gotti was afraid of that. I think that John Gotti was afraid that Angelo Ruggiero was going to get killed. He wanted to defend his friend. He didn't like Paul Castellano the way he acted. Paul Castellano doesn't go to fucking Della Croce's fucking funeral, doesn't consult with Della Croce on decisions he's going to make. So it was like a big slap in the face for Gotti. And ultimately, Gotti says, you know what, they're not going to bust up my crew. They're not going to do this. And there were rumors that Paul might get a little loose-lipped because he was looking at going away to prison for the rest of his life in the commission case. So when you take all of that into consideration, I don't think he could have sat back. Had he sat back, it might not have worked the way he wanted it to. Obviously, Paul Castellano was going to make that jerk-off Tommy Bellotti the new boss, and that was just an absolute insult to everybody as well. So I think that John Gotti did what he had to do in the time. And for anybody that says that what he did was so against the rules, bullshit. Carlo Gambino did it. Vinny the Chin Gigante did it. Vito Genovese did it. All of these guys killed bosses. So I don't understand how this gets misconstrued in today's time period. But that's the reality of it. I don't think Gotti could have waited. But as a result, Angelo paid for selling drugs. He was shelved. The commission called for his death, but Gotti made a great argument that, it's a friend of mine. He did something wrong, and killing him isn't going to solve the issue. That doesn't hurt. Killing somebody, whatever. Punishing them by shelving them and they're not allowed around the mob ever again, that's punishment in and of itself. And it's an argument that Gotti made to the Chin, and the Chin agreed that, Angelo would be shelved and that would be the end of it. And that directly proves that the Chin didn't want to kill Gotti. Which that gets distorted from Jerry Capisci and all of these other authors who get it wrong every time. Okay, moving on. Smartest mob family in your opinion today? Probably the Genoveses and the Gambinos, but third for me would be Philadelphia. And I say that for a lot of different reasons, but that's pretty much it. More ruthless, Tony Spilotro or Nicky Scarfo. Spilotro killed for a lot of different reasons, but most importantly, he killed for mob reasons. Scarfo killed people because he was fucking nuts. Scarfo just killed people. If he was jealous of them, he would have them killed. If they didn't treat him like he was fucking king, he would have them killed. Guys in Philadelphia were a little leery of Scarfo, and that's exactly why guys like Tommy Del Giorno and Nicky the Crow testified and ratted people out. Had nothing to do with the fact that these guys really had that gene in them, but it was Scarfo. He was killing everybody for no fucking reason. Probably what they should have done instead of ratting is just kill Scarfo themselves. Put two in his head and end it. But, you can't do that because the Chin's the one that fucking installed Scarfo. So Spilotro, I think, was the less of the two ruthless guys, because Scarfo just killed somebody for no reason. He didn't need to have a reason. He just did it. And just go back in history and look at what happened in Philadelphia during the Scarfo reign. Scarfo was the worst thing that ever happened to Philadelphia. The worst fucking thing that ever happened to Philadelphia. And I don't care what anybody says. There's a lot of people that come out speaking, Scarfo was the boss. He was a tough guy. Scarfo was a fucking lunatic, an idiot, a moron. And he fucking absolutely destroyed the Philadelphia Mafia in every fucking sense of the word. Then that other nincompoop John Stanfa comes, which I could talk about all day, but I think Scarfo definitely was the more ruthless of the two. Who was more of a boss, Castellano or Frank Costello? Which was more vicious? I don't think either one of them were particularly vicious. I think that Castellano would have people killed if he wanted to. He'd go to DeMeo to do it. Ultimately, that would come back to slap him in the face. Costello was more of they called him the prime minister. This guy had political ties and allegiances, was able to keep the mob functioning with bribes and payoffs. He was legitimately a fucking boss. Paul Castellano was a joke. He wasn't a gangster. He was a business guy that got the job because of who he was related to. Castellano never picked up a fucking gun in his life. His big claim to fame was trying to rob a fucking store and not ratting. People bring that up to me all the time. Well, when Paul Castellano could have ratted people out, he didn't. He tried to break into a fucking store. They stole $200 fucking dollars and he didn't tell anybody. Way to go, Paul. You're a fucking stand-up guy. No, Paul Castellano just by nature was a business guy. He wasn't a gangster. Gangsters run crime families, not businessmen. Frank Costello, on the other hand, back in the old days, involved with Murder Inc., he wasn't afraid to do what he had to do. And I think that if you looked at them two side by side, I think Costello would kill somebody a hell of a lot quicker than Castellano ever would. And you also got to look at it like this way. Paul Castellano defended the police. You got a fucking mob boss who's telling his guys, the real tough guys are the cops that go into these domestic beefs and they don't know what's going on and they're not afraid and they go running in to help people. How are you going to legitimately look at anybody that's killing people for you, breaking legs for you, and tell them that the police are fucking heroes? In his own mouth, he got busted. He talked in his own house. Nobody talks about that. In his own house talking. Gets caught on his own wiretaps. So he can sit there and bitch about fucking Angelo Ruggiero. But here's, and I'm going back to something really quick because Paul, the edict was from Carlo Gambino, nobody sells drugs, they die. Whatever, that's bullshit. Gambino took profits from drugs, right? Paul Castellano, this has been the edict. We don't sell drugs. Meanwhile, Paul's cousins are in fucking North Jersey, Rosario Gambino and the other Gambinos, and they're selling fucking heroin. So how can you tell Angelo Ruggiero he can't do that when you got your cousins doing it in Jersey? Paul never complained about the profits from drugs, believe me. He just didn't want to get caught for them. And that's exactly what happened. But Paul had lots of people selling drugs. Hypocrisy. That's all this is hypocrisy. But for my money, Frank Costello is a real gangster of the two. All right. Let's see. Philadelphia versus New York. What's the difference these days? There's a lot of differences between New York and Philadelphia. And I want to say this in sort of a quick way because I think I have like one more question and I got to get onto the show. But the point is that Philadelphia is much smaller. And the way I compare this is to like a big corporate building. The president knows the vice president, right? They know each other. The vice president might know senior VP or junior VP. But then when you start moving down the chain of command, do you really think that the president knows like Johnny Nuggets who works on the 7th floor punching keys on his computer? No, he doesn't. HR might know them, but even HR in a big corporation doesn't really know him that well. They just know that he has a position here and that's where he is. That's how I look at Philadelphia versus New York. New York is a big corporation. Philadelphia is a fucking mom and pop run store. Everybody in Philadelphia known each other 30 fucking years. They're very, very fucking tight. The problem that Philadelphia does have, though, is that anytime that there's been a rat, these are interlopers. These are guys that aren't known by the hub of what is Philadelphia. They aren't known well. You know, it's like another, and I'll make this as an example. I know somebody, we'll call him Guy A, all right? Then I know somebody else who's Guy B. Guy B is a hardcore gangster. Guy A is on the fringe. I am not about to take Guy A and introduce him to Guy B. I'm not going to do that because Guy B is my friend. And I'm not about to take anybody that I can't trust for 100% around Guy B. And that's what ends up happening in these smaller places like Philly, is that somebody will know somebody, they know them, but they don't. They bring them around, and then all hell breaks loose. That's what notoriously happens in Philadelphia. Philadelphia's just got to isolate. Isolate yourself. Stay off the fucking radar. Isolate the queen bee. Not that I'm calling anybody a queen. I'm just saying, think of it in terms of that. Protect the queen bee at all fucking aspects. Nobody talks to queen bee. Nobody. They got to go through the whole entire army before they even get close. That's the big mistake. That's the difference. New York, guy at the top probably doesn't know an associate. And he shouldn't even meet a fucking associate to begin with. Because back in the old days, fucking an associate couldn't talk to nobody at the top. Associate had to talk to another associate who had to talk to a fucking capo, who had to talk to a soldier, to a capo, and it just went up and up and up. You never had a one-on-one with anybody like that. Are you shitting me? And the mob families that have survived, the capos don't even talk to the boss. They talk to somebody else, and it goes back. It gets filtered. That's how you survive. You isolate. Because guess what? If you can't talk to somebody, like one-on-one, then you can't get caught on a wiretap, and you can't fucking testify. And it's just the reality of it. So the difference is that New York is the big corporation, and Philly is the mom-and-pop store. I have a lot of respect for both, but there is something to marvel in close connections and people that grow up with each other. You cannot infiltrate that to save your fucking life. To me, that's smart. Okay, I think... okay, one last question. Here we go. How would the old bosses use and defend today's technology? One, I don't think they could. Technology being what it is, imagine if they had fucking Instagram back in 1960 at the fucking Havana conference. Imagine how well that would have played out. So the idea, I don't think that the old guys could have survived today's technology, especially when you take murder off the fucking table. Murder has always been an ends to justify the means. It's a way to control people, right? So you take murder off the fucking table, what the fuck do people got to be afraid of? You go back to 1960. If a mob guy was going to kill you or hurt you, you were paranoid. You were petrified because it wasn't just coming from one. It's coming from multiple different sources, right? So with today being a little different, with cameras being on every street corner, every phone having a motherfucking camera, fucking wiretaps out the ass everywhere, it's virtually impossible to get away with everything. You will get away with certain stuff. But I don't think they would survive today. And the second part of this question was, what would they do to end the endless stream of informants? Murder. That's how you end it. If nobody fears talking, then what do you got? Unless somebody's a fucking maniac like John Vesey, the rat piece of shit that he is. They killed his fucking brother a day before he's supposed to testify. He did anyway. But if you're not afraid of somebody and you're not afraid of an entity, what's the point? The days of the 60s are over. And I'm not saying that there still isn't fear that's injected, because there is, but it's not the fucking same. Guys think twice before they do stuff now. It's all about money. That's the way it should be. Wasn't it Luciano that said fucking the bottom line to all of this is money, money, money. Everything else is fucking secondary. Money. We want to earn fucking money. We're not about to put ourselves out there, do dumb shit, unless it's affecting the bottom line, and the bottom line is money. It wasn't about ego and respect. That's where this whole fucking Hollywood fantasy comes into fucking play. With The Godfather. Oh, you didn't respect me. Fuck respect. There are some ego guys that need to have that, but the bottom line is, you can think whatever the fuck you want about me. I'm making my ends. But the minute that you step on my toe and you interrupt the way I make money, or you put a stop to the way I make money, then we're going to have a problem. That's when murder becomes sort of a solution in that lifestyle. But until informants are afraid, or until the FBI stops fucking letting them do what they do, then it's going to keep going that way. I'm not justifying murder. I'm just saying, if you're not afraid of somebody, then what can they possibly do? What can they possibly do? We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to get to Carmine Galante. Stay tuned on Mob Talk Radio. And welcome back to Mob Talk Radio. We are talking about Carmine Galante today, amongst other things. So let's jump right into it. Carmine Galante was born in 1910 in East Harlem. The family immigrated from Castellamare del Golfo in Sicily in 1906. By the age of 10, Galante would be sent to reform school because of his criminal activities. Soon after, he would form a street gang on the Lower East Side. By 15, Galante had quit school in the 7th grade, and as a teenager, he became an associate of the mafia, which was during Prohibition time. He would become a leading enforcer by the end of the decade. When not cracking heads, he worked as a fish sorter and even worked at a flower shop at a young age. December 12th of 1925, Galante pleads guilty to assault. Then in December 26th of 1926, he was sentenced to 2.5 years in state prison. In August of 1930, Galante was arrested for the murder of a police officer, Walter Di Castilla, during a payroll robbery. A payoff was made, and Galante would never get indicted for that crime. Later in 1930, NYPD officer Joseph Meehan catches Galante and other gang members attempting to hijack a truck in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. A gun battle ensued, and Galante shot Meehan and also shot a 6-year-old girl who was standing nearby, but that child actually survived. So from a very young age, we see that Galante isn't afraid to use a weapon, isn't afraid to kill a cop, and is reckless enough that an innocent 6-year-old child is caught in the crossfire. In February 1931, after pleading guilty to attempted robbery, Galante was sentenced to 12.5 years in prison. While he's incarcerated, the prison psychiatrist labels Galante a ranting psychopath. In May of 1939, Galante is released from prison. So from a very early age, obviously Galante had a lot of problems. I don't put a lot of stock into the idea that a psychiatrist was absolutely correct, but I think when you're going to kill a cop and you don't care who's standing by, onlookers or whatever, I would say that you probably have some problems. By 1940, Galante is killing people for Vito Genovese, who at the time was the underboss of the Luciano crime family. Galante also had a reputation for being crazy, vicious, unrepentant, and someone who actually enjoyed killing people. Also during this time, the NYPD suspected Galante of being involved in at least 80-some murders. So Galante also terrified the NYPD and other mobsters. He was a guy that was known in the streets as somebody who didn't give a fuck and somebody who would kill. When you have been accused or allegedly accused of 80-some murders, that's pretty significant. I think a lot of people don't mention the numbers associated with that, but that rivals a lot of other people. But once again, those are allegations that really can't be substantiated because it's more word of mouth than anything. In 1943, Galante kills Carlo Tresca. Carlo Tresca was the publisher of the anti-fascist newspaper in New York. The paper was actually called Il Martello. And this person, Carlo Tresca, would continuously blast Benito Mussolini in the paper, and he would absolutely blast the mafia. He called Benito Mussolini a class enemy and a traitor. He also spoke out vehemently for Sacco and Vanzetti. Sacco and Vanzetti were Italian-born American anarchists who were controversially convicted of murdering a guard and a paymaster during an armed robbery of the Slater and Morrill Shoe Company in Braintree, Massachusetts. You can look up that case. It was renowned for the time. Tresca also spoke out publicly, like I said earlier, against the mafia. And Galante, through Vito Genovese, who at the time was in hiding in Italy due to murder charges of his own, went to Mussolini. Vito Genovese did. And he said to Mussolini, I can take care of this guy Tresca. We can get him to shut up and not a problem. Mussolini says, go right ahead. And basically, Genovese offered Tresca's head on a platter. And ultimately, Genovese takes the murder contract and gives it to Carmine Galante. It was not a murder for hire, so to speak, deal. It was simply he was doing Mussolini a favor. January 11th of 1943, Carmine Galante spots Tresca crossing the Fifth Avenue at 13th Street. He pulls up beside Tresca, jumps out, runs up right behind him, and shoots him in the back of the head. But because so many people hated Tresca, the police could not pin down a perp, even though they had heard rumors that Carmine Galante was likely the suspect. There was nothing they could do, but they did, however, arrest him anyway. But shortly after he was arrested, they let him go, and nobody would be charged for that crime. However, Galante would be sent back to prison on a parole violation on December 21st, or excuse me, he would be sent back to on a parole violation, and then on December 21st of 1944, he would be released from prison. Galante from there would go on to chauffeur Joe Bonanno. Then he would ultimately become a captain, and then he would ultimately become the underboss. He was incredibly loyal to Joe Bonanno, and also like Joe Bonanno, he absolutely hated Carlo Gambino. In 1953, Bonanno sends Galante to Montreal. He does this for many, many reasons, but there's one specific reason. Galante was sent there to oversee the narcotics business. The Bonannos had, at the time, a deep partnership with Vic Catroni. You can look up the Catroni crime family. I don't want to get into all of the history of that. But the Bonannos at the time were importing vast quantities of heroin, importing it through Afghanistan to Corsica, France, Montreal, and then it would come into the United States. Joe Bonanno has always said he wasn't involved in the smack business. That's an absolute fucking lie. He absolutely was. And that's the reason why he sends Galante to Montreal to begin with. And then in 1957, due to Galante's strong-arm tactics, he was shaking people down and murdering people. The Canadian government tosses Galante out of Canada. They basically deport him back to the United States. But in that time period that he is in Canada, he is connected to at least 20 murders which dealt with drug carriers who either missed a shipment or who were late delivering those shipments. In October of 1957, Bonanno and Galante held a meeting in Palermo, Sicily. The meeting was held at the Grand Hotel de Palms. This is a very infamous meeting, which we've talked about before. The meeting took place from October 12th through the 16th. It was also referred to as the Palermo Mafia Summit. Prior to the meeting, Sicily was just a mere starting point for the narcotics trafficking. But at the meeting was Joe Bonanno, Carmine Galante, John Bonventure, Frank Garofalo, Lucky Luciano, Santos Sorge, John DeBella, Vito Vitali, and Gaspari Magaddino. On the Italian side of that was Sal Greco, Giuseppe Genco, Angelo Barbara, Gaetano Baldamente, and Calcedonio De Pisa, Cesar Maranzala, and Tommaso Buscetta. Ultimately, this would lead towards the future to the pizza connection. So what you have is a meeting where they all get together and they're discussing the narcotics trafficking. Luciano long believed that American mob bosses getting involved in drug trafficking was a good idea. It was highly profitable, one they needed to get involved in, but he did not want American mob bosses touching it. He didn't want them directly involved in an A to B kind of thing. So sort of the idea here was to bring in the Sicilian connection, let them handle every bit of the trafficking, and in turn, they would get protection. They would be able to come to the United States and be contract hitmen, and they would also be able to take a percentage of certain rackets. And one of the things that was sort of interesting about all of this is that ultimately, like I said, it would lead to the pizza connection, but that would be a little bit sort of down the line. This was just the initial agreement. It was also discussed prior at the Havana conference as well, but things just didn't solidify at the Havana conference. But it was originally brought up there, and then it ended up really being decided on at the Sicilian, at the Palermo Mafia Summit. Galante would import zips, and what zips are Sicilians, and he would import them from Castellamare del Golfo to function as bodyguards for him, contract hitmen, and drug traffickers. And Galante unequivocally trusted them. He trusted them more than he trusted his own counterparts, which would ultimately come back to haunt him in the end. In 1958, Galante is indicted for narcotics conspiracy. Galante fled and went into hiding. Then on June 3rd, 1959, the New Jersey State Police pull over and arrest Galante while he was driving on the Garden State Parkway heading towards New York City. Federal agents knew Galante was hiding, and obviously living on the Jersey Shore, but they could never seem to find him. And finally, like I said, they were able to get him on the Parkway. He would be arrested. He would post a $100,000 bond and was released. Then in May 18th of 1960, Galante gets indicted on a second set of narcotics trafficking and ends up turning himself in. Galante's first trial begins November 21st of 1960. One of his Confederates, believe it or not, was William Benvena. And if you don't know who that is, here's some Goodfellas lore. It was Billy Batts. The infamous Billy Batts character was Galante's co-defendant. The first trial was a joke. Jury members would drop out. Alternates would drop out, so much so that the judge would order a mistrial in 1961. But the reason why he ordered the mistrial was that the jury foreman in that case fell down a flight of stairs in an abandoned building in the middle of the night and could not get back to jury duty because he was hospitalized. Obviously, it doesn't take much for us to kind of figure out exactly why that happened. Then in July of 10th, 1962, Galante is convicted in his second trial. He would be sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. One of the things that Galante had an issue with was drug trafficking. He's a guy that didn't learn from the first time, didn't learn from the second time. Vito Genovese had the same kind of problem. In 1964, Joe Bonanno and Joe Magliocco attempt to plot the murder of the commission. Bonanno ends up getting chased as a result. And the Bonannos seemed to lose a lot of the power that they had. Then in January of 1974, Galante exits prison and within days orders the bombing of Costello's door to his mausoleum. Galante really always blamed Costello for Bonanno being forced to retire. This sort of goes back also to Costello and the hit attempt of Vincent Gigante, which could be directed back to Vito Genovese, which could be directed. There's just a lot of things that were involved in it, but ultimately Galante was a Bonanno supporter, and he blamed Frank Costello for the demise of Joe Bonanno and everybody else, and that's why he bombed the front doors to his mausoleum. Galante had actually planned on killing Costello when he got out of jail, but lucky for Costello, he died in 1973 before Galante could reenact his revenge. In November of 1974, the commission names Rusty Rastelli the boss. And he would become the official boss of the Bonannos. But not long after Rastelli is sent to prison, and Galante would absolutely seize control of the family. Galante was hell-bent on going after the Gambinos, and because they had encroached on what Galante considered his drug empire. And what that means is, while he was in prison, the Gambinos had made headway into Sicily, the Gambinos had made headway into New Jersey, and they were beginning to sort of step on toes in what Galante considered his drug empire, and he didn't want anybody else putting their hands in the cookie jar, so to speak. By late 1978, he had killed at least 8 high-ranking members of the Gambino crime family who were involved in the narcotics trade. So what you see happening is a couple of things here. The first thing is Galante does not appreciate the hierarchy of the mob. Galante does not appreciate the commission. He blames the commission. He blames the Gambinos for what happened to Joe Bonanno. He considers the Gambinos getting near his drug trade a carnal sin. And so what he decides to do, besides not respecting Carlo Gambino and the wishes of the commission, starts killing Gambino people in an effort to get them to back off the drug trade and the fact that he just didn't like the Gambinos in general. And the Gambinos knew at the time that Carmine Galante was responsible for the murders. And they were sort of stuck in a situation. The situation being they could kill him, and it would probably spark a lot of problems because at the time Galante did have a lot of the contacts into Canada with the drugs. And it would just spark a big problem. On the other hand of that, they wanted him dead. He had gotten a little bit too brazen. His power had gone to his head. And so it was a situation where it's how long do we ignore this? How many more people is he going to kill? Do we step in now or do we wait? In March 3rd, 1978, Galante's parole was revoked by the U.S. Parole Commission, and he was sent back to prison. Galante what he had done is he had violated his conditions by associating with other Bonanno members, which we've seen time and time again. February of 1979, a judge ordered Galante's release, ruling that the government had illegally revoked his parole. So Galante walks out of prison, and he's determined to ruin the Gambino crime family. He is fully compelled to take control of the drug business, and the other 4 families of the mob have just had enough. Galante is making waves. He's got a big mouth. He's got a big ego. He doesn't want to follow the rules. He wants to do what he wants. So they attempt to reason with him. But Galante absolutely refuses to listen to what they have to say. And then he makes another fatal mistake, and he refuses to share in the profits of narcotics with the rest of the crime families. So not only is he doing what he wants, he's spitting in their face, telling them to fuck off, killing fucking made guys and associates from another crime family. They go to him as sort of like a what the fuck are you doing kind of a meeting, and he essentially spits in their face again. He refuses to share in any of the profits of narcotics. Then he makes a statement to the commission, and the statement that he makes is literally towards any retribution the commission might take against him. He said, "Nobody will kill me. They wouldn't dare. They don't got the balls." So right away he's asking for it now, because now he's mouthing off. Now he's doing what he wants. He's refusing to share in profits. And now he's essentially telling the commission they lack the fucking balls to do anything to him. Frank Funzi Thierry specifically had enough of Carmine Galante and sent word to leaders of the other crime families for a consensus regarding Galante. Now, Galante and Funzi Thierry go way back. They had a lot of problems against one another. Thierry had every ulterior motive to have him clipped. But what they do is the commission sends out feelers to the other crime families to see if anybody would go along with the idea of essentially doing a hostile takeover and killing Carmine Galante. Joe Bonanno was even asked and consulted, and the results were all the same. Kill him. The fact that they went to Joe Bonanno at that point, I really don't understand why they would, because Bonanno at that point had realistically been shelved. He was done. But I think they did it to sort of gauge a bearing, because they didn't want Bonanno to take issue with it or take umbrance with it and start a war, even though Bonanno technically was done by that point. But everyone was in on it. So what happens from there is ultimately Rusty Rastelli has to give the final word, because even though he is not technically the boss and Galante is, they defer to him. And he says the same thing. Go ahead and kill him. And also Joey Messino was involved in that. This is a very complicated kind of thing. First thing the commission does is they make sure the other families are okay with it. They go to Rusty Rastelli because they realize that if they take him out, Rastelli then would probably be back as boss, so they want to make sure that that's okay with him. But really the guy that was behind approaching the commission and Rastelli was Joey Messino. And he was really a guy that was behind that movement as well. He obviously wanted power for himself, but he was sort of in respect to Rastelli. He liked Rastelli, and there's a chain of command there. And what essentially happens out of Messino going back and forth to Rastelli and the commission reaching out to other crime families is that the commission issues a death sentence for Carmine Galante. On June 12th of 1979, Galante gets killed on the patio of Joe and Mary's Italian restaurant off Knickerbocker Avenue in Bushwick. Galante was eating with Leonard Coppola, Giuseppe Torano, Baldassare Amanto, and Cesar Bonaventure. At 2:45 p.m., 3 ski-masked gunmen enter and open fire with shotguns and handguns. Galante, Torano, and Coppola were killed. Amato and Bonaventure were unharmed. Now, when I mean unharmed, I mean they weren't even touched. If you're going to do a hit, you're going to kill everybody there, and they didn't, which should tell you that Amato and Bonaventure were obviously in on it. They obviously knew what was happening. The fact that Galante allowed himself to be sort of out in the open was probably a big mistake. I think his ego sort of fed the narrative there. The shooters in this event were Bruno Indelicato, Dominic Trinchera, Dominic Napolitano, and Louis Gangetti, and they were hired by Alphonse Indelicato. Philip Carlo, in his book, had stated that Richard Kuklinski was involved in the hit and that Richard Kuklinski was there prior, sort of watched what happened and got involved. That's an absolute lie. I will never, and I have a lot of respect for Philip Carlo, but what I will never understand about him is how he allowed himself to be corrupted and lied to. Kuklinski put himself at the Hoffa murder. Kuklinski put himself at all kinds of murders. And the reality is Richard Kuklinski was a fucking serial killer. Richard Kuklinski was not a mobster. Richard Kuklinski didn't work for the mafia. Richard Kuklinski inserted himself in a lot of things. Now, the only tie to the mob that Richard Kuklinski ever had was through Roy DeMeo in the porn business. Roy DeMeo shook him down effectively, and that was the end of it. If you look at Richard Kuklinski's body count, I think there's one person that had sort of mob ties. The rest of them were all people that just pissed off Richard Kuklinski. So I don't understand to this day why Philip Carlo wrote that. First of all, there's no substantiation. Even the FBI said he was really just a serial killer, was not a mob hit guy. Richard Kuklinski would rob, steal, pillage, and plunder, but he was not a mob guy, and I don't know why that gets repeated. But what Philip Carlo really says was that Roy DeMeo hired Richard Kuklinski to be there to help kill Galante because the Gambinos wanted representation at that hit to make them feel better, which doesn't really make sense either, because I think that most times when you look at mob murders in general, they don't want their own representatives there. They'll hire outside of the family sometimes to take care of family business. That way that they can have plausible deniability. And in this case, I don't believe anything Philip Carlo said. I think that a lot of his book on Richard Kuklinski, the Iceman, was fiction, was just absolutely unequivocally not true. I don't know why Philip Carlo did that, and I guess we'll never know because Philip Carlo has passed away. But he definitely didn't tell the truth. His book on Gaspipe Casso is also sort of the same way. There's some truth, but a lot of lies. And I just think that Philip Carlo took the word of people versus actually investing in time and looking at the court transcripts and et cetera, et cetera. And this is in no way, shape, or form to blast Philip Carlo. He's an author. He's going to write a book. But I just think that there's a lot of inaccuracies historically in his books. And that's just the reality of it. If it was just an opinion of his, that would be one thing. But he is taking what these guys say is gospel. And when you write a book, you just can't do that. George Anastasia knows all about that at this point, doesn't he? So the life and times, and granted, I sort of rushed through Galante a little bit, but really to encapsulate him historically is he was a guy that was hell-bent on doing what he wanted, thought he was tougher than he was a tough guy, but I think he thought that because of his murderous past that he allowed himself to have some wiggle room, and the truth is he didn't. He shouldn't have taken up the fight with Joe Bonanno. I mean, he was loyal to Joe Bonanno his whole entire life, and in the end, was Joe Bonanno loyal to him? Absolutely not. He told the commission, go ahead and kill him. I don't give a fuck. And that's really something I want to point out that's going to kind of lead me down a rabbit trail about Joe Bonanno. And I wasn't meaning to go here, but I think it's worth pointing out. Joe Bonanno, historically, for some reason, has been looked upon as the second coming of fucking Jesus Christ. And I don't get it. The Godfather was somewhat modeled after Joe Bonanno and his fairy tales. But let's look at the commission case for just 1 second. Rudy Giuliani, who I can't fucking stand, he looks like Nosferatu, had said that had it not been for Joe Bonanno's book, he never would have known the commission existed. He wouldn't have known how to prosecute that case because Joe Bonanno laid out the groundwork in his book. Joe Bonanno also lied repeatedly in his book that the mafia was just sort of a gentleman's club meant to enhance the Italian lifestyle. Get real. Get real. Get real. This is a guy that openly in a book talked about murders, but then somehow sort of weaved a tapestry of epic bullshit by saying we never got involved in drugs. Drugs was a no-no. Somehow they were morally superior, and he just didn't get involved in that sort of trade because it was a vile thing to do. He was the biggest fucking drug dealer there was. The fact that he could honestly write that in a book and not laugh and take himself seriously is just absolutely a joke. This isn't about trashing his legacy or anything like that, but let's have a little validity and some truth. He was one of the biggest people that set up the narcotics trafficking lanes throughout Corsica. He was directly tied to the French connection, directly tied to the fucking pizza connection. There seems to be this myth that the mafia doesn't sell drugs. And that's a lie. That's been a lie for a very, very long time. And it's not in any way to chastise them, because what they do is what they do. They make money any way that they can. But take Carlo Gambino, like I said earlier, a good example of that. His edict was apparently we don't sell drugs. Well, he put his cousins in, like Paul did, in Jersey to sell narcotics. Let's look at Angelo Bruno. Angelo Bruno didn't want anybody in Philadelphia, his guys, selling drugs. But he allowed the Gambinos to sell drugs in Jersey and he took profits off of it. So how can you, as Angelo Bruno, look at your guys and say, you guys can't sell drugs, you're not allowed to do that, but I'm going to let this other crime family do it? Then on top of that, take Angelo Bruno, who really should own territorially, should own all the casinos, but he wants to share with the rest of the crime families and tell his own guys they can't have a part. So sometimes your allegiance needs to be to your own guys. And with a lot of these guys that we talk about, there just doesn't seem to be that. And so maybe the myth of being loyal and allegiant to some extent is bullshit. Galante certainly wasn't loyal. He was loyal to Bonanno in a sense, but was Bonanno loyal to him? Absolutely not. Unequivocally not. Bonanno wasn't loyal to anybody but himself, and I will never understand why history and people praise him and commend him. Joe Bonanno damaged the mafia more than any rat I've ever fucking seen. Sure, Sammy Gravano testifies, blah, 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 blah. Whitey Bulger, blah, 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 blah. Joe Valachi, blah, 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 blah. Joe Bonanno lays it out from beginning to end. That commission trial decimated every single fucking mob family there is. And then some. He even destroyed fucking Canada. So how Joe Bonanno's not labeled a rat or a snitch is beyond me. He wrote a fucking book. He laid it out. He did TV interviews, talked on newspapers. Then the dumbass in his fucking 80s gets his idiot son Bill Bonanno to try to shake down car dealerships in fucking Arizona. And they get caught doing that when they were told by the commission to knock it the fuck off and stop and stay out of the life. That's why on my list, Bonanno's never even on my list of top 5 or top 4, top 20 even. Bonanno was good at certain things, but it was his thumb at the nose of the commission, the idea that he wanted to kill everybody on the commission. He writes a book, tries to make it this like aristocracy when it's not. Because the reality is, look what happened to Galante. He was loyal to Bonanno. Bonanno wasn't loyal to him. Go ahead and kill him. What do I care? I'm done. And so that's what we see historically with a lot of guys. Vito Genovese was the same way, almost a clone of Galante, just as ruthless, but he thought he was above it all, and he stepped on a lot of toes, and ultimately he was set up, and he goes to prison the rest of his life, swearing if he ever gets out, he's going to kill everybody, but he doesn't. He dies in prison, and that's the way that historically this usually ends up. There is a very big truth in what John Gotti said when he said, listen, you either go to jail or you get killed. There's no other way around it. You got one or two options when you enter this life. And so I think to round out Carmine Galante, I think it's worth saying that had he not got involved in the drug business, I think that ultimately he would have had a longer run. I think that he picked up the loyalty torch and he was loyal to the wrong guy. He should have been loyal to himself and the people underneath of him, and he wasn't. Greed was the almighty thing for him, and ultimately that's why he's killed. You can't just run amok and do what you want. And those are the old days. Those are the old days. Things are not like that these days. They're definitely different, but greed is always at the top of the list. You can be a real shitheel in real life, but as long as that money's coming in, nobody's going to say shit. And then when you go, they take your businesses, and that's the reality of the life. And so I think, in final, looking back at Galante, one of the things that I like to do is trace where they misstep, where they fuck up. And I think Galante, the biggest thing he did was he didn't learn from the first fucking conviction of drug trafficking. He could have just as easily laid back, still been a part of it, but just not been as active. And he could have collected his money, been relatively low-key, but he didn't. He wanted to thumb his nose in everybody. He didn't want to share in any profits. And he followed Bonanno loyally, but also blindly and deaf. And ultimately, he paid with his life for it. And that's sort of how history will look back. And obviously, there's the historic picture of him laying on his side with a cigar jetting out of his mouth with bullet holes all in him. But that's the reality of it. The reality is that nobody's untouchable. Nobody's untouchable. But the guys that survived that time period were able to be businessmen as well as gangsters. They did what was best for crime and best for their families and best for everybody involved. They didn't think just about themselves on a daily basis. And the guys that survive all of that, Carlo Gambinos of the world, now he was good. He was sneaky. He was good. But he also knew when he needed to be sort of diligent in extending olive branches. He needed to be diligent in sharing in the spoils of war. The guys that didn't make it. And that's just really sort of how the mob works in a nutshell. All right. So next week we are going to probably do a Q&A, and we're going to have all new topics. You can check us out on Twitter at RealMobTalk7. Give us a like, give us a follow, give us a threat, whatever, because you people do all kinds of different shit. Check us out on Facebook at Mob Talk Radio. And once again, any questions you might have, either inbox me on Twitter or inbox me on Facebook. We do have some exciting things coming ahead in the future for Mob Talk. October, I think, is going to be the shift of when things change. And as we get closer to that, I'm going to start revealing more things about what we are going to do. It's not just going to be radio. It's going to be radio, articles, and there's also going to be some film stuff. So look forward to that. There's a whole thing that I'm planning on doing called Mob Haunts. And I think that's going to be very popular. You're going to get to see some places that most people either don't have the time to go check out or don't know where to go find it. But I'm going to bring that to you in video format, obviously. And we got guests coming on the show. There's a lot going on. It's just there's so much going on that it's hard for me to sit down and go A, B, C, D, and E. But once we start getting closer to like September, I'm going to start dropping some hints of what's going on and things and directions that we're going. But the show is going to get a lot different. Same sort of stuff, same narrative, same story, same history. But, I want to do a couple of things, a couple different ways. We're going to have on some really good guests that you would never expect that I would have on the show. And I think that's going to be exciting looking forward. So just continue to watch the videos. Please share them. Even if you fucking hate me and just want to say I'm a cocksucker piece of shit or whatever. Just go ahead and share our stuff. That's like the biggest thing. The more outlet we have, the more we can do. And that's sort of the theme. This isn't just my show because had it not been for everybody that does listen, there wouldn't be a show to begin with. And what I do isn't easy. Anybody that says it is full of shit. But all that being said, I want everybody to have a good week. We'll be back again next week with an all-new show. In the meantime, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, threats, etc., you know where to send them via Twitter at RealMobTalk7 or hit us up over on Facebook at Mob Talk Radio. Give us a like, give us a subscribe. And other than that, I think we'll see everybody next week.